further east to a location called Montauk area, and there was a military base called Fort Hero, which was operational. It was an Army base and an Air Force base at that time. The Army part of the base had been there since before World War I. The Navy was there with submarine pens since before World War I. But the Air Force moved in the early 60s with some specialized radar systems they were testing long range over the ocean, and eventually the SAGE system was moved in there about 1963, and that was decommissioned about 68, 69 because they went to the DEW Line project in Canada, still longer range and further north, and all of the SAGE systems around the U.S. were dropped. In that interim, the base was abandoned, was held as surplus property by the General Services Administration, and this group who was already there stayed.
The mind control group.
The mind control group. And they continue their projects. Now, other projects under the Phoenix Project, and I cannot say I know all of those which have been put under that little umbrella. Phase 1 was mind control, and that was moved to Montauk. That is to that location at the abandoned base.
Would you comment a little bit on the other German inroads into mind control, namely the usage of cocaine, the regular usage of cocaine by their officers and engineers?
Well, there you get into a very touchy subject, because in the United States today, cocaine is considered a controlled substance and a drug which will do you harm. I know a British scientist who came over to the U.S. prior to or just slightly after World War II, and when he was going through school, he regularly used cocaine. He said everybody in England did. Nobody had any bad effects from it. Nobody considered it a drug, and nobody considered it harmful. It is, after all, a derivative of cocoa, the cocoa leaf. And while it is a sort of energy and psychic booster, he used it to stay up all night and study for his exams, and then be out bright and early and never going to bed, to his classes the next morning to take his exams, and he passed them. Now, this was not limited to England. And it was also being used in Europe and in Germany, and at that time there was no control on the substance prior to World War II, and for some time thereafter. And it was regularly used by a lot of these people as a sort of psychic booster. Now, here you get into a very delicate matter in terms of the medical interpretation of what cocaine, not talking about other drugs, other hardcore drugs, but cocaine itself, as to whether or not it is habit-forming or not. I understand generally considered it is not habit-forming. In the use or misuse by young people under the age of 21, it can lead to the use of other harder, more dangerous drugs, but of itself might not be considered so dangerous. None of the reports by the LaGuardia Commission in the 30s in New York indicated there was any problem from marijuana or from some of these other drugs, and they were then, at that point, wide open in usage. There was no control on them in the 30s, in the U.S. or elsewhere, to my knowledge. The controls on these were only established after World War II, and would not come down as a tight, hard control with the controlled substance laws we now have until 1965. It was that late. And that, of course, included LSD and many of the other mind-bending drugs, but cocaine was not in that category. These people use it regularly as an energy booster and to sharpen their wits, their mentality.
And probably meditation and tapping into higher database. Possibly
meditation. Definitely some of these compounds, particularly peyote, as one example, and LSD is a synthetic, but peyote was a natural derivative from the peyote mushroom, was definitely used and still is used by the American Indians as part of their rites, but it has been used by many people experimentally in the past as a means for expanding the human consciousness and looking into other areas beyond the normal physical reality. The government couldn't have this for one simple reason. They were interfering with the CIA's MK-Ultra program and certain other programs the CIA was involved with, which involved mind manipulation. And if you get somebody with an expanded mind, with more awareness and more understanding, they will be able to see through these other programs. But if you cut off the means,
somebody patched your memory.
Right, if you cut off the use of these materials or their availability, then you're not going to be able to take a better look around you. You might not be able to find out that your mind has been tampered with on one of the government projects, which were rampant in the U.S. and Canada. In Canada, from the CIA, from the late 40s onward, And it's basically the chemical drug aspects from the early to mid-50s. And MK Ultra was only one program. There were many others. You also had other programs underway, which started in 47, went on through 52, for finding the basis for changing the memory structure, changing the personality, completely and totally if the CIA or whatever agency wanted to do this. And these programs were instituted by Dr. Wilhelm Reich in Rangeley, Maine in 1947 when he signed a 5-year contract with the CIA to do research, which was, according to what he was given to understand at the beginning, the initial point, the CIA was, quote, interested in 2 aspects. One was development of psychic ability, finding a means to improve or enhance psychic ability. The second part was they wanted to find a means to deprogram people who had been programmed.
To brainwash them?
Well, they didn't.
Old memories?
They didn't state that to Reich, but he soon found out that's what they wanted. And he blew his stack and falsified the experiments.
Contract killers, if necessary.
Right. He found basically the means whereby you can totally reprogram a human mind at will and change its structure, its intent, its the memory patterns, the memory functions, commands being built in to control that individual so they were no longer a free agent, even though they might be under the impression they were. Certain command methods could be used to have that pre-programmed person on command do something which had already been programmed into them by CIA, NSA, or whoever was using these techniques. This was all part of the mind control programs of the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And this stemmed from basically German work and from some Japanese work, because the Japanese work comes into the picture later in the 70s onward using RF techniques, microwave, and satellites. But this required a great deal more research in between after the beginning programs of the 40s and the 50s. Wilhelm Reich threatened to expose the whole business to the public, and he was then they attempted to hold him to court once in 1954. He refused to show and he got away with it. He sent a letter to the judge. But he was inherently unhappy with what he had been used for and said he would never work for the CIA again. In fact, all of his lab personnel were armed to the teeth to keep out one particular government agency, and that was the FDA. If any FDA personnel ever showed up on any of his lab property, orders were to shoot first and ask questions afterwards. Other government agencies he cooperated with.
It was very interesting for me, the connection that you were discussing yesterday between some certain indoctrination techniques by Indian yogi cults that were later introduced into the CIA, indoctrination techniques that involved some specialized sexual practices.
Oh, this had nothing to do with yoga practices. This was a direct offshoot from the Wilhelm Reich techniques and Wilhelm Reich's research. Basically, we'll not go into the whole 9 yards of it on camera, but basically what Reich discovered in that 5-year period from 47 to 52 was that there was a great relationship between the mental functioning of the human and sex and the orgiastic state, as he called it, and that he found that in the orgiastic state, if you could hold that point where the person was about ready to have an orgasm, but not have the orgasm, you were held at a peak point of nervous excitation. At that point, this human subconscious and the human conscious locked together in an open line. And everything that's in the subconscious becomes available to the conscious mind.
The soul connects to the mind.
Right. Therefore, you can reprogram that person if you know what you're doing. And Reich found out partially how it could be done. And the CIA, after many years of work, and the NSA found out how you could complete this so that a person could be programmed with certain inbuilt mechanisms, functions, memories, change memories, whatever. And while the initial techniques were more physical, after some time in the 70s, they developed purely electronic techniques which would induce the orgiastic state and hold it electronically. And these pieces of equipment are in every hospital in the United States which accepts federal funding by law.